Okay, so today's webinar is going to be about how graphs can help you innovate and accelerate digital transformation within the company. And Neo4j has been around for quite some time, 10 years or so, and since the infancy of graphs. And in that period, we've learned quite a lot about how graphs are properly implemented and how we can help you speed up the learning of graph, which is why we wanted to put this presentation in place. So quick introductions. I'm Jan Aartsen. I run the professional services organization for Neo4j, and dialing in from the other side of the ocean. This is very early for him. Thank you very much for getting up so early, Alessandro. We've got Alessandro Svensson. You want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yes, my name is Alessandro Svensson. I am the head of Neo4j Innovation Lab, and I am based out of San Francisco in San Mateo, where we have our US headquarters. Yeah, it's indeed early, but I'm happy to be here and share this presentation with you all this morning.
Thanks for that. So I'll quickly run through the agenda of today. Just to make sure everybody understands how graphs and Neo4j fit with innovation, we'll do a short intro on that topic. So for those of you who have attended other Neo4j webinars, there might be a little bit of a repeat here, but we just want to make sure everybody has the right context. And then we'll move into a discussion as to how graphs actually help you accelerate digital innovation, and how we at Neo4j have learned to accelerate that digital innovation. And then once we are beyond that agenda point, we'll start speaking specifically about two services offerings that we have put together over the years. One is the Neo4j Innovation Lab, and the other one is the Neo4j Bootcamp. Two specific packages that both fit in, let's say, in the phase where our customers are still evaluating graph technology and need to rapidly come up to speed as to what graph technology is, what it can do for them to evaluate the software. So we'll talk through those two packages and explain how those can help you to get started with graphs. That's the agenda. About Neo4j. I can be pretty short, but a couple of key facts. Neo4j has been around for more than 10 years. We've helped incubate graph databases as a category, and to date are by far the leading graph database on the market. The majority of Fortune 2000 companies have experimented with Neo4j or have adopted it on a large scale. And we have an open source heritage background. We have a community edition, which has been downloaded over 13 million times. So pretty staggering numbers that we've piled up over the last 10 years. After that introduction, I'll hand over to Alessandro, who'll walk you through the introductions on graphs and further down the agenda.
Awesome, thank you very much. So yeah, I'm gonna start by giving you a quick sort of like 1-minute overview, if by chance anyone isn't familiar with the concepts of graph, just so that we are aligned with the terminology going forward in this presentation, because this is a word that we're going to use quite a lot. So first of all, the term graph is somewhat confusing in the sense that most people think of charts and diagrams when you mention the word graph. And in fact, if you run a Google search on the term graph, this will be the result, right? However, if you add the word theory to that same Google query, you will end up with something that looks, that sort of expresses the mathematical meaning of the word graphs. And this is what we talk about when we talk about graphs. It's essentially data points that are connected to other data points in the shape of a network. And from a data perspective, a graph is a way of organizing and querying data. This is data as it would be conceptually represented in a relational database, and this is that same data represented as a graph. So if a graph is a mathematical structure used to model relationships between objects, then a graph database is simply a technology that stores and queries data in the shape of graphs. And that's really all I'm going to say about the concept of graphs. And I hope everybody is sort of brought up to speed on what we mean when we talk about graphs and connected data networks. What we really do want to talk about, setting the stage for this presentation before we go into the labs and the boot camps, is discuss a little bit how graphs actually matter in the context of digital innovation. And a good place to start, if you want to understand the impact of graphs for the past sort of 15 years or so, is to study the disruption that has happened within the consumer web. We see that in industry after industry, you see huge disruption where companies have challenged incumbents. And what these disruptors understood was that a connected approach to data was a vastly better fit to the web than a static approach. And the results are the Googles of the world, the rise of social networks, decentralized peer-to-peer money transactions, etc. And this list can be made very long. But what they all have in common is that they made this sort of shift in perspective mainly, in this shift from a static approach to their business domain to a connected approach to their business domain. And today, we like to argue that the most sort of strategically significant use cases that we see have connectedness as a fundamental pillar, right? And but however, the reality is that most data is still stored, siloed, and processed in the shape of rows, columns, and tables. It's the footprint of the RDBMS world it's so strong out there, and also have a very real place in sort of mission critical operations where that sort of structure might not be the best or natural fit to solve sort of the challenges that these companies have in the future, but also in the present. So today we see our customer base and community leveraging graphs for use cases as connected insights, making predictions, building granular recommendation and personalization engines, and also creating these huge sort of knowledge networks around their business domains, which are, of course, very connected problems. So what unifies our customer base are essentially two things. And this is regardless if we're talking about, a legacy company, if you will, like a Walmart, or more digital sort of native company like an Airbnb. In terms of use case by use case, what we see is that they feel that they are very enabled by connections, that they see that they can derive extraordinary value from the connections in their data, but use case by use case, they're still held back by a legacy, right? That data is stored and sort of computed in silos with a technology that is not necessarily fit for connected data. And what we find very fascinating is that there's such direct impact when adopting a connected data mindset. So if you consider a couple of different business domains, in this short example, we can think about the maintenance of equipment. It could be collecting the data about your user base, storing research data in different silos, etc. If you're in healthcare, for example, and all of this data that you handle eventually ends up in some sort of database storage, and typically an RDBMS system. So what we see is that when you sort of make this paradigm shift into connected data and equipping your developers, solutions architects, data scientists with a graph skill set, those same business areas can now be sort of evolved, right? Like, and we see the transformation of what was once information about users can now be expressed as knowledge networks or knowledge graphs. Maintenance scheduling can be approached in a way that is more predictive, which is a very connected problem. Multi-silo research will now be cross-silo research, etc. And all of this is ultimately sort of enabled by the shifting of perspective. That's the only thing that really happened here. So just by making that sort of jump from something static to something connected, even if you don't actually change the sort of like the business domain or the business models even, it just opens up so much opportunity if in fact the problem that you're looking at is a sort of naturally connected problem. So with that as a context, I'm going to talk to you, or we're going to talk to you today about some programs that we have put in place for accelerating this, the pace in which you go from sort of the static side to the connected sides, and the way you do that in a way that it's as fast as possible, because speed matters a lot when it comes to innovation. And one of the most sort of fun things with working in a company like Neo4j is the privileged insights that we have into enterprises' adoption of graphs. There is, as Jan mentioned, there's no graph company on the planet with a larger sort of footprint in the enterprise world than Neo4j. So we get to learn a lot about digital transformation projects simply by working with all of these big companies. And especially interesting is to study what we refer to as sort of best practice adoption, meaning the accelerated pace in which companies find and implement new use cases. So if you look at these green rectangles here, so they represent the first use case for these sort of Fortune 200 customers in different industries. We have, like a big airline customer, a major European telco, major US telco companies, etc. And what we see here is that when they have been, successful with implementing one use case in production, we see that in the pace they add, like the second, third, fourth use case, etc. They do that in a way that is very, very fast. So we have asked ourselves, what are the skill sets and the processes that were required for them to move this quickly? And based on kind of like our experience working with all of these companies, how can we help share that knowledge and create programs to make sort of this accelerated pace of adopting graphs happen also for the first use case that you have in place when you sort of start out greenfield. And that's the idea of the programs that we're going to discuss today, which we called the Neo4j Innovation Lab Sprint and the Bootcamp. And again, the whole point here is to accelerate the time to validation. That's the whole idea with these programs. And we also appreciate that evaluation of new technology is very hard. Like nobody wants to replace a database system, voluntarily, right? And there's a lot that goes into such a decision. But the goal here, anyways, for everyone that we work with is to sort of make that jump from whatever legacy systems that they have today, which they feel in one way or another are sort of holding them back. And we want to get from sort of that pain point all the way to being in production with graphs, right? If we're talking about a connected data problem. And typically what we see from our data is that it takes about 9 to 15 months for companies to sort of like validate this themselves, even before they get to a point where they can move into proof of concept. And that is a very long time, depending on kind of like the disruption that is going on within your business domain, right? What we've seen here is by participating in our bootcamps and innovation labs that we have managed to help customers dramatically decrease time to validation. So for the rest of this presentation, we're going to talk about these programs, describe them a little bit more in detail, and also how you can engage with us hands-on if you see something interesting in this for your organization. And again, we leave some time in the end for questions. Yeah, we can end this session also with a bit of a Q&A. Cool. So I'm going to talk to you about the Innovation Lab, which is the program that I run at Neo4j. It's a global team that works mainly in Europe and in North America. But we have the capability to work wherever in the world. But that's basically sort of our main markets at the moment. And in a nutshell, what we do is that we help companies accelerate innovation and transformation through what we call graph thinking to kind of get into that mindset. The way we do it is that we generate and prototype graph projects together with customers and prospects, which would be you in this case. And the expected outcome here is not to build something that is necessarily, sort of production perfect. It's to kind of like build enough to provide a deep understanding of graph thinking and the new possibilities in innovation and transformation that is enabled by adopting Neo4j and graphs and this mindset, really. And the methodology that we use is something that we call the Innovation Lab Sprint, which is a 3.5-day design thinking workshop. And if I go through our methodology in a nutshell, this is it's pretty straightforward in the sense that we start with identifying kind of like the target use case that we want to work with on. That use case spawns a bunch of sort of graph-related questions upon which we generate a data model. We build prototypes and wireframes around that model, and then we end this whole experience with what we call the executive feedback presentation. And this is kind of like a key component here, that we are not, the intention here is not to build something perfect, but it's to build sort of enough for you guys to take further into the organization to get sort of like a decision on whether to move forward on these concepts to a POC or don't do it, which is equally important. The key here is that you want to reach sort of like a validation decision quickly and not spend months and months sort of contemplating whether this is right or not. So that's the whole intention, to sort of like accelerate that process. And if you look at this a little bit more in detail, we have breaking it down in the sense that the sort of the first third of this experience goes into the sort of like the use case generation part, where we look very closely into sort of like the challenges that you have, the opportunities that you see, sort of like the strategic roadmap, how all sort of key entities in terms of like roles, system, functions, etc. Relate to each other, and that is typically a good base for us to have enough kind of like input around your business domains and the challenges that you're up against to sort of hone in on and identify a target use case to work on. And during that first third of the sprint, we actually end up with a pretty robust data model, because in all of these sort of challenges, opportunities, and North Stars that we are exploring, there's a ton of sort of connected, naturally sort of embedded connected questions upon which we can generate data models. Then in the sort of second phase of the sprint, we materialize this model that we have built, basically sourcing data and populate this model to sort of test it out. But we also make sure that this model lives in a scenario that makes sense, right? So we also craft kind of like a value proposition and then a business scenario where this model, against which this model will be tested. And that gives us enough input to start sort of building prototyping and wireframes around this. And then we end the sprint on sort of like a half day on the fourth day, where we finalize the sprint and we have this sort of executive presentation set up. And what this looks like a little bit more, sort of like the experience of this, is that the first third, where we generate use cases, a very sort of design thinking type of setup, where we need to flush out a lot of information and do that quickly. We work, these are actually like real photos from real sprints. And as you can see, the teams that we work with on the customer side are very cross-functional. They're both sort of business users, but also technical users. After sort of that first generating phase, we move into data modeling, where of course we can leverage the fact that graphs are kind of naturally intuitive, which means that even if you're a business user, you can sort of like follow along in terms of understanding models, etc. And quite quickly, we actually move into to quite advanced Cypher and the data models that we come up with aren't of course, sort of perfect in the sense that we bias towards, working fast as opposed to, accurately in detail. But still, we never sort of like dumb down the process in the sense that we simplify the complexity of the domain that we're looking at. We do want to generate models that really capture sort of like the complexity of the business problem that we're looking at. And then we move into the last phase, which is prototyping, right? Like, and here we start also very sort of low threshold in the sense that it's kind of like sketchy, but even here we want to move into a more refined state to really explore kind of like the art of the possible of what we're looking at. We don't want to make sort of like the prototypes obscure. We actually want them to be beautiful and to give us a sense of tangibility that, okay, if we now have implemented this new sort of intelligence, like what would be the impact that we see on our business processes, whether it's a sort of consumer facing prototype or if it's dashboards or whatever sort of like the business domain requires. This ends up with sort of, we do like enough to build prototypes to show kind of like the art of the possible. And the Innovation Lab team as a configuration looks like this. So from a Neo4j perspective, we always have three components. We have a lab leader, which is sort of like the head facilitator. We bring a senior Neo4j field engineer who obviously covers the engineering part and the data science, which is, our kind of like natural habitat. And we also always have a UX designer or a process designer that sort of facilitates the storyboarding and wireframing exercises, and also builds the UI tools for prototyping when that is necessary. And on the customer side, the participants are typically between 3 and 8 participants, and our default recommendation is to make these teams as cross-functional as possible, just to sort of add richness to the use case that we are exploring and that we're looking at. And typically these groups that we work with are these sort of like digital transformation and innovation teams that are sort of there to get pulled out of the complexities of the day-to-day, right? To work with us for 3.5 days in a very sort of like intense workshop to solve something comprehensively and do it in a way that is fast. So this is not an exercise that you kind of like walk in and out of, right? It's something that you participate in with intentionality, and these companies or these groups sort of like appreciates that this type of innovation doesn't really happen sort of like within your silo, right? Like you actually need to kind of step out and give yourselves the time to the time and space to work with us to really look at this problem, almost like entering a little bit of a bubble, right? And typically the sponsors are also higher up in their organization, in the sense it can be like an information officer, or it can be initiated from like a head of an IT department, or even the CEO, where the executive feedback presentation then is sort of like presented to someone who is a decision maker. So this is in broad strokes what it looks like. And here are some examples of these executive feedback presentations. What you see here is essentially presentations of the results of this work. And as you can see, it's a very sort of horizontal approach, in the sense that we, even though the methodology has been exactly the same for all of these, we have worked with financial services company, healthcare companies, heavy manufacturing companies, fast-moving consumer good markets, etc. And the outcomes become very, very different, given that the domains are so different. But the sort of like the methodology that we have followed is basically down to a T. It never alters. We go through all the same steps, but of course, if the input varies, the end result will vary as well. And and with that, I'll hand over to you, Jan, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of this talk.
Awesome. Thanks, Alessandro. Okay, so the second services offering that we wanted to talk about is the Neo4j Bootcamp, which is a slightly different beast. It focuses more on the so whereas the innovation lab, as you've just seen, is very cross-functional and focusing on the business value and the innovation that graphs can bring. When you're evaluating technology, there's always a moment in which you also need to do the technical evaluation part, and that is where the bootcamp comes in strongly. So it helps customers to accelerate the technical learning around graphs, so that they have an understanding how far they can push this technology. And most of the time when customers buy this package, they already have a good understanding of which business case they're going after, maybe because they've already done an innovation lab. And then they just want to understand how much of this solution I will build in the future, how much of that can I cover with graph technology, and how far can I push graph technology. Okay, and a good way of doing that is by providing some training, hands-on, and a bit of prototyping with the technical team. Now, I know we've used the word prototyping also before. I'll go further down in the presentation. I'll explain the differences between the prototyping we do in the innovation lab and what we do in the bootcamp. So at the end of this training, the technical team needs to have a deep technical understanding of what graph technology is. And as I explained, most of this is done in a classroom training format, with hands-on exercises. The whole team have Neo4j installed on their laptops, and they obviously have plenty of time to ask questions around the technology. The agenda is a 5-day agenda, which is typically led by one of our field engineers. And out of the 5 days, the first 2 days are typically classroom training. Now, if you would want to go through the entire training curriculum of Neo4j, you probably need somewhere between, depending on what you want to do, 5 or 10 days of product training to get the deep level expertise. But the objective of the bootcamp is not to deliver a full-blown product training. It is to make sure that people know enough of Neo4j to evaluate the technology. So what we will do is typically cover topics out of the graph fundamentals training, graph modeling, and Cypher, which is our query language, and then complement, those are the basic building blocks, and complement that with topics that we believe are relevant to the industry and the use case of this specific customer. Okay, so it's the basic training materials plus selected materials that are appropriate for the use case. Once we've got the technical team up to speed on this technology, we get everybody behind their laptops, and typically what we will start doing is take a data set from the specific customer, investigate some of the requirements. So we ask us what some requirements up front. Again, strong difference with the innovation lab, because he is really looking for requirements, whereas here we expect customers to already bring some requirements to the table. And then we will just investigate together with the customer how graph technology can help them answer specific questions using their own data. So day 3 of this exercise is very much requirements analysis oriented, a lot of whiteboarding, designing a graph model that we think is appropriate, explaining why that graph model is appropriate. 5 is really about elaborating that prototype, writing queries against it, discussing what a front end could look like, and what APIs could look like. All of this is very focused on the code level. Some customers try to or tend to push the bootcamp more in the direction of also having a small functioning prototype that they can show Other customers who might have a larger in mind might end up after the bootcamp more with a set of code samples, let's say, that they can further on in their project implement, and that just gives them the certainty that that they've got a code basis of which they can start, and they can start working with should they want to go into a proof of concept or a larger initiative to evaluate graph technology. The whole bootcamp exercise is topped and tailed with a briefing session and a debriefing session where we ask the executive sponsor or the team lead of the technical team to be present, so that we create the right context, and that at the end of the whole session also capture the learnings and see whether there's still any gaps in the execution of the bootcamp. And that's kind of the agenda. As Alessandro did, I've taken a couple of images that give you a taste of what it could look like. The first day is classroom training, then you get into the modeling sessions. There's a lot of whiteboarding, day 3, and then day 4 and 5 is really coding behind the laptop, starting to use APIs, and this is where it gets pretty technical, and definitely more technical than the innovation lab. Okay, I quickly want to talk through the engagement model. Whereas the innovation lab, as we said before, has 3 people participating, the bootcamp only has one field engineer in the room. In order to make sure that this whole process runs smooth, typically there's a couple of phases we go through, and I won't talk about the sales phase. It's probably less important in this context, but typically we'll have an engagement manager set up the logistics and organize a kickoff call, and a couple of things that are really important to make the bootcamp run smooth is, as I said before, understand whether our customers have a good understanding of the business problem they will try to solve with graph technology. So we try to ensure that we have insight into that upfront. Otherwise, that delays the kind of slows down the bootcamp and reduces the efficiency. We make sure we have the right type of data to work off. And also what we sometimes ask the participants to do is install the software up front, and possibly even do some self-study. Those are things that can accelerate everything. And all of these things help us accelerate the bootcamp and get more efficiency out of the whole engagement. After the bootcamp, we typically do a closeout call, just to check whether all technical questions that customers may have towards graph technology are answered. Any outstanding questions will obviously solve, and typical follow-ups of a bootcamp, we'll talk about those things later. Typical follow-ups of the bootcamps are then maybe go into a full-blown POC where we assist customers or help them immediately define their project if they are already convinced, or if they are fully convinced of the technology. So far the engagement model. Both Innovation Lab and Bootcamp, we've been experimenting with both of these offerings for several years now. Have received great feedback from various customers. I won't go into detail, but overall, I think the general feedback is the speed with which it's allowed our customers to evaluate our technology. Now that we've gone through Innovation Lab and the Bootcamp, I quickly want to highlight the differences. And I hope from both Alessandro's and my explanation, the differences have been highlighted already. But I quickly want to go through this again because we get this question regularly from customers, and part of the setup of this webinar is just to explain the difference between the two packages. So whereas the Neo4j Innovation Lab is really helping customers get up to speed with what is my graph business case, and where can I really change the way I do business fundamentally using graph technology. The bootcamp is much more about, okay, if I'm convinced that graph technology can change my business, how can I convince the technical people that they can get up to speed with this and that they can build what needs to be built? Okay, that's the big difference, which means the bootcamp is specifically for a technical audience, where in the innovation lab you might get a mix of both. As I already highlighted, participants on the innovation lab are on the Neo4j side are actually 3 people, whereas the bootcamp is a little bit closer to a training setup where we've got a graph engineer fronting the room. Apart from that, I think I've highlighted the outcomes, the deliverables, and those are the differences. Now, the innovation lab and bootcamp can also be complementary. What we see most of the time is, or what we see often, is customers first engaging in an innovation lab where they then decide or get convinced that graph technology can solve one or multiple of their business problems. And at the end of the innovation lab, they then pull the technical team into a room to do a deeper assessment and gather all the necessary knowledge to do a POC on that specific use case. Okay. The other way around also happens. Sometimes we have customers that do a boot camp and get up to speed with our technology, and actually roll out the first use case. At which point they come back to us, very enthusiastic about graph technology, and say, we've now made this investment in your technology. What else can we do with it? At which point we set up an innovation lab and explore additional use cases with them, so that they get more return on investment from the same licenses. Okay, that's so that's how innovation lab and boot camps can be combined. I just wanted to quickly highlight, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. Obviously, innovation labs and boot camps are not the only services offerings that we have. These are the ones that typically sit in the evaluation phase, where customers evaluate the software. And in that evaluation phase, we can, by the way, also help out with proof of concepts for some of our customers. We've actually just built the entire proof of concept. But obviously, we also have services that help customers through the implementation phase, this regular product training, staff supplementation, all the way up to actually delivering the entire graph implementation. And we also have services offerings around rollout, support, and maintenance of graph solutions, which goes all the way up to actually managed services of your graph solution. So we do those things too. Again, that's not what this presentation is or was about, but I just wanted to make sure that we give you the larger context of our offerings. At which point, if you guys want to know more, you are free to contact either Alessandro or Marcel.